Gieves and Hawkes, Brooks Brothers, Aquascutum, 7 Savile Row and heritage fashion names you'd recognise on a label, and not one of them means what it used to. Every one of them still trades. Everyone still prints its founding year somewhere on the packaging, 1818, 1851, 1771. And in most of these cases there's no company left behind the name at all. There's a trademark, owned by someone you've probably never heard of, and licensed out to someone else entirely. That's brand licensing, and it's the mechanism that runs almost everything on this list. I want to be straight with you before we start, because this is the kind of subject where it's easy to be unfair. Some of what follows was genuinely a rescue. 2 of these brands only still exist because a large retailer bought the name out of administration and kept it breathing, and I'll say so when we get there. What I'm not going to do is pretend that the thing you're buying now is the thing that was founded. Counting down from 7. Number 7. Austin Reed. Founded in 1900 by Austin Leonard Reed, who claimed to be the first menswear retailer to bring made-to-measure quality to the ready-to-wear market. The first shop was on Fenchurch Street, and by 1911 he'd opened a flagship at 103 Regent Street. That address belonged to the brand for 105 years. When Regent Street was rebuilt around it in the 1920s, the shop didn't lose a single day's trade. Austin Reed entered administration in April 2016. Administrators looked at several bidders, including Sports Direct and a couple of well-known retail entrepreneurs, but the only viable buyer was Edinburgh Woolen Mill. And what Edinburgh Woolen Mill bought was the brand, the stock, and 5 outlet concessions, not the shops. 120 standalone stores wound down by the end of July. Around 1,000 people lost their jobs, and the Regent Street flagship's 105-year residency ended in a closing down sale. Then Edinburgh Woolen Mill relaunched it online, announced plans for 50 new stores and a London flagship, and before any of that happened, collapsed itself in November 2020. So here's where Austin Reed sits now. The name is still registered, there's no shop, there's no company, and there hasn't been an active retail presence in Britain since 2020. What's left is an asset on a balance sheet somewhere, waiting for somebody to decide it's worth reviving. That's the mildest version of what happens on this list, which is why it's at 7. Number 6. Jaeger. Started in 1884 by a British businessman called Lewis Tomalin, under the fairly extraordinary name Dr. Jaeger's Sanitary Woolen System Company. The premise was that clothing should be made from animal fibre rather than plant fibre, for health reasons. It was a Victorian wellness theory that happened to produce very good wool coats, and the coats outlived the theory by about a century. Now, follow the ownership. The private equity firm Better Capital bought Jaeger in 2011, which ended in administration in 2017. Edinburgh Woolen Mill, the same buyer as Austin Reed, took the Jaeger brand and its debt, but not the main company, not the 700 staff, and not the money owed to suppliers. Then administration again in November 2020, when Edinburgh Woolen Mill itself went down. And in January 2021, Marks & Spencer bought Jaeger for £5 million. The brand only. Not the 63 shops, not the 13 concessions. Those closed. This is one of the 2 I promised to be fair about, so here it is. Marks & Spencer relaunched Jaeger properly in October 2021, with a new managing director, a new identity, and an actual product range built around the natural fabrics and tailored outerwear the brand was known for. Jaeger exists today because Marks & Spencer bought it, and without that it would be exactly where Austin Reed is. But that's 4 owners in 10 years and the shops are gone. What Marks & Spencer acquired was a name with a good reputation attached to it, and what they've done with it is reasonable. It's a label inside another retailer's business now, rather than a company in its own right. Number 5. Kent and Curwen. Eric Kent and Dorothy Curwen set up in London in 1926, making regimental, club and college ties for Oxford and Cambridge. They bought a knitwear factory in the 1930s and produced the brand's first cricket jumpers, that cream jumper with the coloured trim at the neck, which is more or less the entire visual identity of the brand to this day. They dressed the Hollywood Cricket Club, they sponsored the costumes for Chariots of Fire, and they made staff uniforms for Wimbledon. Eric Kent died suddenly in 1939, aged 46. Dorothy carried on until her death in 1972. In 2015, David Beckham signed a 5-year agreement to become the face of the brand, and by all accounts he was properly involved in it. Product development, store design, expansion. A flagship opened in Covent Garden in 2017. There was a Peaky Blinders collaboration, and for a few years Kent and Curwen looked like the one British heritage name that had worked out how to be modern without embarrassing itself. Underneath all of that, the company holding the UK business was owned by Trinity, and Trinity was owned by the Chinese textile group Shandong Ruyi. By 2019 that UK entity was £18 million in debt, staff numbers had been cut by close to a third, and salary costs had been halved. Kent and Curwen today is owned by a Chinese garment group called BML Dulk. I'm not going to pretend I can tell you a great deal about them, because there isn't a great deal publicly available, and that's rather the point. The cricket jumper is still on sale. The company making it isn't the company that made it.
Number 4. Aquascutum, 1851. A Mayfair tailor called John Emery opened a shop at 46 Regent Street and developed a chemical treatment that made wool shed water. He called the result Aquascutum, which is Latin, roughly, for water shield. The coats went to the Crimea, and they went to the trenches. Margaret Thatcher wore one in Russia in 1987, which is probably the most photographed Aquascutum coat in existence. In 2012, the company went into administration and was rescued by a Hong Kong investment firm, YGM Trading, for £15 million. YGM sold it on a few years later for a figure reported at around 97 million, and the buyer was Shandong Ruyi, the same group that would end up holding Gieves and Hawkes, Kent and Curwen, and Charuti. Shandong Ruyi was, at its peak, often described as China's answer to LVMH, a conglomerate assembling Western luxury and heritage names at scale. The debt that came with that ambition, something in the region of $4 billion, is what ended it. Then Shandong Ruyi ran up something in the region of $4 billion of debt and stopped funding things. Aquascutum went into administration again in September 2020. Its historic Jermyn Street shop never reopened after the lockdowns, and the brand withdrew from the United Kingdom altogether. So if you want an Aquascutum trench coat today, a British raincoat, invented in London, proven in a British war, worn by a British Prime Minister, you buy it online, in China. Meanwhile, Burberry, which faced many of the same pressures as a British heritage outerwear brand, made the opposite journey, building its Asian business while keeping its domestic identity intact. That contrast is worth sitting with. I've spent a fair bit of time in these ownership records and that one still stops me. Not because it's the worst outcome on the list, because it isn't. It's that the product is so specifically British that its absence from Britain is almost funny. Number 3. Hardy Amies. Sir Hardy Amies founded his couture house in 1946 on Savile Row. He'd made his name before the war at a Mayfair couture house called La Chasse, where he became managing director at 25, and he spent the war in the Special Operations Executive. Then he came back and built one of the very few British houses that could genuinely be called couture. He dressed the Queen for the better part of 40 years, not occasionally, but as her dressmaker, through the coronation era and out the other side, and he was knighted for it. In the 1950s and 60s he moved into men's ready-to-wear, and he's part of the reason Savile Row learned how to sell clothes to people who weren't having them cut individually. Hardy Amies London Limited was dissolved in 2024. There's no acquisition in that sentence, no conglomerate, no private equity firm, no licensing group, no intellectual property portfolio. Nobody bought the name and put it on a polo shirt. The house reached the end and stopped, and an address that had been a working couture house for the better part of 80 years became just an address. Of everything here, this is the one I'd argue is cleanest, because there's something almost dignified about a business ending rather than being hollowed out and worn. It does mean that if you want a Hardy Amies suit, there's now precisely one way to get one, and that's second hand. Number 2. Brooks Brothers. Founded in New York in 1818 by Henry Sands Brooks, and America's oldest ready-to-wear clothier. It dressed 40 United States presidents, and it made the coat Abraham Lincoln was wearing the night he was shot. For most of 2 centuries the name meant one thing quite precisely, which was American tailoring at a price that reflected what it cost to make. Brooks Brothers filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in July 2020, and in August it sold for $325 million to Authentic Brands Group and Spark Group. Authentic Brands Group is worth understanding because it explains most of this video. Authentic owns something north of 40 brands: Brooks Brothers, Eddie Bauer, Champion, Forever 21, Billabong, Sports Illustrated, the licensing rights to Elvis Presley's likeness. What Authentic does not do is manufacture anything at all. It owns intellectual property and licenses it out to operators who make and sell the product, and Brooks Brothers' actual operations now sit with a company called Catalyst Brands. That structure, owning the trademark law and the intellectual property, licensing out the rest, is the model that's come to define what happens to heritage brands when they run out of road. So when you buy a Brooks Brothers shirt, you're buying a garment made by a licensee, or ACIC, sold under a trademark held by a brand portfolio company, carrying a founding date of 1818 that refers to a business which no longer exists in any operational sense. That isn't a scandal. It's a completely normal, legal, widely used structure, and it's made a lot of money for people who are good at it, but it's also the purest example of what this entire list is about, which is why it's at 2 and not 1. Number 1. Gieves and Hawkes. Thomas Hawkes opened a shop in Brewer Street in 1771, selling to gentlemen. His firm made military caps and uniforms. The Wolseley pattern helmet came out of that business, and it held a royal warrant from 1809. Separately, the Gieves family firm was doing much the same thing for the Royal Navy out of Portsmouth. In 1912, Hawkes and Company bought No. 1 Savile Row from the Royal Geographical Society for £38,000, partly because the firm had dressed so many of the explorers who'd set out from that building. And in 1974, Gieves bought Hawkes, which formed the name you know today. 250 years. The Duke of Wellington. A royal warrant for every British monarch since George III. And No. 1 Savile Row, which is the best address on the street, held freehold. Now, the last 10 years. May 2012, acquired by Trinity Limited, a Hong Kong conglomerate. 2017, Trinity is bought by Shandong Re. September 2021, Trinity is hit with a winding up petition over debt, the group goes into liquidation, and Gieves and Hawkes goes up for sale with a real prospect of closing permanently. November 2022, Frasers Group buys it, with all 5 UK stores included, Savile Row, Bath, Birmingham, Chester and Winchester. Frasers Group owns Sports Direct. It also owns House of Fraser, Flannels, Jack Wills and Agent Provocateur, and it holds significant stakes in Mulberry and Hugo Boss, and it described the purchase as adding to a portfolio of luxury and premium investments. That's the fair description, and I'll give it, because the alternative on the table was liquidation. People in the tailoring trade said at the time that Frasers had saved it, and they were right. 10 years, 3 owners, 2 countries, 1 near death. The address never changed. Everything behind it did. And if you walked down Savile Row this week and stopped outside No. 1, you'd find it shut. It's been closed since the end of June for alteration, due to reopen later this year. That's the pattern, and it's worth naming plainly. In almost none of these cases did anyone set out to destroy a heritage brand. What happened is that the name and the company came apart from each other. The company, meaning the workshop, the staff, the accumulated knowledge of how to actually make the thing, turned out to be the fragile part. The name turned out to be durable, tradable, and endlessly re-licensable. And the name is what's on the label. I said at the start I'd be fair about the rescues, so let me finish there. Marks & Spencer kept Jaeger alive, Frasers kept Gieves and Hawkes alive, and the workshop at No. 1 Savile Row is still cutting. Those are real outcomes. And a brand surviving under an owner you find unromantic is a great deal better than a brand not surviving. But that founding date on the label is doing a job it hasn't earned in most of these cases. 1771 is a real date. It just isn't a promise about who owns the building, or who cuts the cloth, or where the money goes. If this was useful, hit the like button, it genuinely helps. And I want to know which one you'd bring back if you could only pick one. Austin Reed, Aquascutum, or Hardy Amy's. Tell me in the comments. And subscribe if you want more of these.